The morning sun had only just begun to spill over the rooftops of St. Mary Mead when Miss Marple stepped out into the crisp air, her basket in hand and a shawl wrapped snugly around her shoulders. The village was unusually quiet, as though it were holding its breath, and she noticed the faint rustle of leaves along the hedgerows with a heightened sense of awareness. Today was the day of the St. Clement's Garden Tea, an annual event that combined the charm of springtime blossoms with the gentle bustle of villagers eager to display home-baked cakes, preserves, and embroidery. Miss Marple had attended each year without fail, not merely for the sociality, but because she enjoyed observing the subtle interactions, the small dramas that unfurled between neighbors, and the peculiar nuances of human behavior that so often escaped notice. She arrived early, pausing for a moment to admire the careful arrangements of roses, foxgloves, and primroses around the long table set beneath the shade of the elms. There was a lightness to the day, but beneath it Miss Marple detected faint currents of tension. Mr. Sims, the local baker, was unusually fidgety, adjusting his apron more than necessary. Mrs. Price Ridley, immaculate as ever, conversed with several ladies at once, her eyes darting intermittently toward the vicar's niece, and even the children, normally boisterous, were whispering and sneaking glances at one another as though sharing a secret too fragile to speak aloud. By mid-morning, the tables were lined with visitors, some local, some from nearby towns, and the cheerful murmur of conversation filled the garden. Tea was poured, and delicate sandwiches and scones were offered. Miss Marple, with her quiet composure, observed the guests from a shaded corner, noting the subtle hierarchy that governed even this gentle gathering. The way certain villagers inclined deferentially toward Mrs. Bantry, who had a reputation for sharp observation and influence, how the vicar's niece, Clara Dane, lingered at the periphery, seeking guidance yet striving to maintain independence, and how Mr. Pendleton, a solicitor recently returned from London, spoke with an air of authority that made others nod in acknowledgement, even when they did not fully understand his words. Each small gesture, Miss Marple realized, could be a key to understanding the relationships and tensions that wove the fabric of the village. It was in such details that motives were often concealed and misdirection crafted. As the afternoon wore on, the chatter grew more animated. A group had gathered near the hedge to play croquet, while others lingered near the tables, tasting raspberry tarts and discussing the latest parish events. Miss Marple noticed a particular exchange. Mr. Lytton, a distant cousin of the Gresham family, leaned toward Mrs. Gresham herself, speaking in what appeared to be hushed tones. She observed the slight tension in his shoulders, the rapid movement of his hands as he gestured, and the way Mrs. Gresham's expression shifted from polite amusement to mild apprehension. Elsewhere, Cecily Parry, a young woman recently arrived in the village, avoided the gaze of the solicitor entirely, her fingers nervously twisting the hem of her dress as she engaged in conversation with Mrs. Hartnell. Miss Marple filed away these interactions, aware that small, easily overlooked signals often proved more telling than overt declarations. Without warning, a sharp cry pierced the pleasant murmur of conversation. A man's voice, high and strained, called from near the far end of the garden. Guests turned abruptly, cups rattling on saucers, while Mrs. Bantry and others rushed toward the source. There, beneath the dappled sunlight filtering through the elms, lay the body of a man, motionless and pale, his hand outstretched toward a tipped-over teacup. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she approached quietly, noting that the scene was almost unnervingly still. The man was identified almost immediately as Mr. Lionel Phelps, a retired policeman from a neighboring town who had recently moved to St. Mary Mead. Shock and confusion rippled through the guests, and whispers began instantly, speculation, accusation, and fear mingling in the spring air. The vicar, Reverend Dane, knelt beside the body, offering what comfort he could while calling for the doctor. Miss Marple, standing slightly apart, observed the scene with calm precision. She noted the arrangement of the body, the lack of apparent struggle, the position of the nearby teacup, and the faint scuff marks in the soft earth that suggested a brief pursuit or sudden fall. As the constable arrived and began cordoning off the area, the village seemed to hold its collective breath. People whispered, some openly speculated, others retreated to gossip in small clusters, while Miss Marple quietly catalogued the subtle reactions. The sudden blanching of Mr. Pendleton's face, Mrs. Gresham's tight grip on her parasol, Cecily Parry's hand trembling as she covered her mouth, and the anxious shuffling of Mrs. Price Ridley's feet. Even the children, usually irrepressible, clung silently to their mother's skirts, wide-eyed and solemn. Miss Marple's keen mind began weaving these observations into patterns, noting connections, inconsistencies, and minor details that might escape even the most diligent of inspectors. She understood instinctively that the tragedy of the day, though immediate in its shock, would unfold over days and weeks, revealing layers of human behavior, hidden motives, and long-concealed resentments. By the time the doctor confirmed Mr. Phelps's death, the garden had emptied in a semi-orderly retreat, though murmurs persisted like an undercurrent beneath the fading sunlight. Miss Marple remained seated beneath the elm, her knitting abandoned beside her, watching the guests depart. She considered the subtle tensions she had observed, the gestures and glances that spoke of secrets, fear, perhaps guilt. The presence of the silver key she had noticed on the ground near the body, small and unassuming, hinted at a larger story concealed beneath appearances. No one had yet seen its significance, and it was precisely in such overlooked details that Miss Marple found her advantage. She knew the unraveling had only just begun, and that the silent witness, every human behavior, every tremor, every glance, would eventually guide her to the truth. The village was quieter than usual the following morning, as if even the birds were cautious in the wake of the previous day's tragedy. Miss Marple, as was her habit, walked slowly along the lane leading from her cottage toward the churchyard, taking note of every detail along the way. The broken fence post near the edge of the lane, the faint traces of footprints in the damp earth, and the way the frost had settled unevenly in the shadow of the hedges. Each small observation, she knew, might hold significance. The inn had opened early, yet only a handful of villagers lingered over breakfast, speaking in hushed tones that betrayed both fear and curiosity. Miss Marple paused for a moment by the post office, where Miss Weatherby, the postal clerk, peered anxiously over her spectacles. "It's terrible," she whispered, as though expecting the very walls to listen. "A man, right here in the garden, and none of us saw a thing. I can't imagine who would do such a thing." Miss Marple inclined her head politely, but said nothing, letting the clerk reveal the undercurrents of gossip that already shaped the village's perception of events. In her mind, she catalogued each remark carefully, understanding that even casual speech often contained clues overlooked by those consumed by emotion. By mid-morning, Inspector Craddock had arrived from Melchester, his expression tight with both professional concern and personal unease. He wasted no time with pleasantries, moving directly to the garden where the body had been found. Miss Marple followed at a measured pace, her knitting tucked under her arm, observing the constable and a few reluctant villagers who had returned to the scene. The frost had begun to melt slightly, and the faint marks in the soft earth were now more discernible. Craddock crouched by the scuff marks, tracing them with gloved fingers, and murmured to his assistant, "No struggle beyond a brief attempt to turn. The force must have been sudden, unexpected." Miss Marple, standing quietly to the side, noted the exact position of the silver key resting half buried in the grass, its delicate chain still coiled neatly. Her mind worked with quiet precision, comparing the angles of footprints, the placement of objects, and the subtle reactions of those present. A sudden insight struck her. The placement of the key was deliberate, almost as if someone wanted it to be found and yet overlooked simultaneously. Word had spread quickly through the village, and a small crowd had gathered, their voices low but insistent. Mr. Pendleton hovered near the church gate, speaking with Mrs. Gresham, whose hand trembled slightly as she held her parasol. Cecily Parry lingered by the hedge, eyes darting nervously from one adult to another, as though she feared being overheard. Miss Marple observed them all with the detached patience that had become her trademark, noting the subtle gestures that betrayed inner turmoil. Mr. Simms's hands twitched nervously, and he avoided Craddock's gaze, while Mrs. Price Ridley whispered rapidly to anyone who would listen, her concern laced with speculation. Even the children, usually carefree, seemed subdued, glancing furtively at the scene and clutching the hems of their dresses and jackets. Miss Marple's mind pieced together the interactions like a delicate mosaic, aware that fear and familiarity often coalesced in patterns that revealed more than overt speech ever could. After the constable secured the area and took the initial statements, Miss Marple strolled to the nearby hedge to examine the scene more closely. The body of Mr. Phelps had been moved slightly by the doctor's assistant for examination, yet the impressions in the soil were still telling. There was a small smear of mud on the hem of the man's coat, an indication of sudden movement before he fell, and faint traces of soil on the stone edging suggested he had been brought slightly closer to the ivy for concealment. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp and unyielding, followed the faint trail of clues, noting that the pattern was deliberate. Someone had intended to stage the scene in a way that confused immediate interpretation, to create the illusion of an accident or at least of randomness. The question was why, and who had both motive and opportunity. Returning to the inn for a brief rest, she found Craddock seated with his notebook open, frowning over the statements collected. "Every witness is consistent enough," he said, tapping the notebook, "and yet something doesn't sit right. No one saw him arrive, no one saw him fall, and no one can place him in the moments before the incident. He wasn't carrying anything unusual, and nothing was taken. It's as though he was invisible until the moment he died." Miss Marple nodded, pouring herself a cup of tea. "Invisibility is often a matter of attention," she said gently. "One only sees what one expects to see. A man who walks quietly, who asks no questions and attracts no notice, may seem present and yet remain unseen by most observers." Craddock looked at her with faint surprise. That could explain a lot, but what about the key? She lifted the small silver object, turning it over in her hand. "It is both invitation and distraction, Inspector. The finder's attention is drawn to it, yet it conceals what truly matters. The answer is not in what is obvious, but in what is overlooked. Someone knew that everyone would see the key first, and the real message would remain hidden." By afternoon, Miss Marple walked once more through the village, stopping briefly at the churchyard and observing the reactions of those she passed. Each glance, each gesture, seemed to confirm her growing suspicion. The murderer was among the familiar, using their apparent innocence as both shield and strategy. She reflected quietly on the day's events, understanding that this was not a hasty act, but a carefully orchestrated one, designed to exploit human behavior. She knew that as the villagers speculated, made assumptions and whispered conjectures, the real truth waited patiently, ready to reveal itself only to those who could read the subtleties. And Miss Marple, as always, would be watching. The following morning brought a brittle clarity to St. Mary Mead, with sunlight striking the frost-covered hedgerows and casting long, delicate shadows across the lanes. Miss Marple, as was her habit, took her early walk along the village path, noting the subtle changes that winter light revealed, the way footprints of the previous day had hardened into distinct impressions, the slight tilt of a gatepost, and the faintly disturbed soil near the churchyard wall. Each of these small irregularities spoke to her practiced eye, suggesting movement and disturbance, moments that the villagers had likely overlooked. She stopped briefly outside the post office, where Miss Weatherby, her nose pressed to the window, fidgeted with letters and parcels, glancing anxiously down the lane as if expecting to see someone emerge from the mist. Miss Marple greeted her with a gentle smile. but the clerk could barely return the gesture, muttering something about the tragedy and the village's fear. Miss Marple took note of the anxiety that lingered in the air, understanding that in a place as small as St. Mary Mead, emotions could shape perception as effectively as any physical evidence. By mid-morning, Inspector Craddock had returned from a visit to the county office, his expression somber and eyes shadowed with fatigue. He moved immediately to the scene in the churchyard, where Constable Reeves had already cordoned off the area. The frost was beginning to thaw, revealing subtle markings in the soil, half-erased tracks, and the faint impressions of the silver key that had been found on the body of Mr. Phelps. Craddock crouched to examine these signs, murmuring observations to himself, while Miss Marple watched unobtrusively from a few paces back. She observed the way his brows knitted in concentration, the slight tension in his shoulders, and the way his gloved fingers hovered over the key before touching it, as if he sensed the weight of its significance but could not yet grasp its meaning. She reflected quietly that a man's experience often told him that the obvious was misleading and that true insight depended on careful attention to what others dismissed as trivial. As villagers gathered hesitantly around the perimeter, Miss Marple noticed the peculiar mix of fear and curiosity in their movements. Mrs. Bantry's eyes flicked anxiously toward the gate, scanning for faces she knew, while Mrs. Price Ridley whispered rapidly to anyone within earshot, offering half-truths and conjecture. Mr. Pendleton, the solicitor, lingered near the vicar, his posture stiff and deliberate, while young Clara Dane kept to herself, her fingers nervously clasping a handkerchief. Miss Marple catalogued the mannerisms, the subtle avoidance of eye contact, the nervous gestures, and the brief tremor in some voices, recognizing the way human behavior often betrayed unspoken truths. She noted that even those who appeared calm were revealing more than they intended, and that among the anxious glances and whispered speculation, patterns were emerging that suggested knowledge, hesitation, or complicity. The constable began taking statements, questioning villagers about their movements during the previous day. Each account, though seemingly straightforward, contained minor contradictions, a hesitation here, an omission there, that Miss Marple observed with keen interest. It was the tiny inconsistencies, she reflected, that often held the key to understanding motive and opportunity. Mr. Sims, for instance, claimed he had been arranging the tea tables at the far end of the garden when the tragedy occurred. Yet the footprints suggested he had passed near the churchyard shortly before the body was discovered. Mrs. Gresham's account was equally careful, precise to the last word, but her gaze occasionally strayed to the vicar, as if seeking reassurance that she had not overlooked anything. Miss Marple's mind worked quietly, drawing connections and testing hypotheses, aware that the final picture would only emerge when the smallest pieces were correctly aligned. By midday, the village atmosphere had shifted from shock to uneasy speculation. Groups formed and dissolved along the lanes, murmuring theories about the possible motive. An old grievance, a dispute over property, a long-buried secret. Miss Marple noted that the most confident voices often spoke with little knowledge, yet their statements served to reinforce the uncertainty and anxiety of the others. Even as people whispered, she observed the undercurrents of guilt and fear, gestures of avoidance, and the micro-expressions of those whose secrets were threatened with exposure. She reflected on the careful orchestration of attention, how the silver key had drawn eyes, how the sudden discovery of the body had created immediate confusion, and how the villagers themselves had become unwitting participants in the concealment of truth. That afternoon, she walked again to the churchyard, crouching to examine the impressions in the softened ground with quiet meticulousness. The path from the gate to the spot where Mr. Phelps had fallen suggested deliberate guidance, not random movement. The soil clung in small clumps to the hem of his coat. The frost had been disturbed in a subtle arc, and the silver key rested in a position that seemed designed to attract notice without offering clear explanation. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. understanding that the answer was not in brute evidence but in the orchestration of attention, in the human behavior that surrounded the object, the body, and the witnesses. She began to piece together the interactions of the villagers, the timing of arrivals, and the subtle tensions she had observed. One or more of them, she thought, knew far more than they admitted, and it would only take careful listening, patience, and keen observation to unravel the truth. By evening, as the light faded and the frost hardened once more, Miss Marple returned to her cottage. She set down her basket and poured herself a cup of tea. Her thoughts concentrated on the small details of the day, the fleeting glances, the whispered reassurances, the nervous gestures, and the carefully controlled statements. Each was a thread in a larger tapestry, a subtle map of human behavior that would lead, inevitably, to the solution. She knew the days ahead would require patience, discretion, and keen observation, for the true story of Mr. Phelps' death had only begun to reveal itself, hidden beneath appearances and the habitual assumptions of the villagers. Miss Marple settled into her chair, her mind already tracing paths, anticipating responses, and preparing for the moment when the silent truth would speak loudly enough to be understood. The morning that followed brought a thin veil of mist across St. Mary Mead, softening the edges of rooftops and hedgerows and lending the village an almost ethereal quiet. Miss Marple walked along the familiar lanes, her shawl drawn tightly and her eyes observant, noting the footprints that crisscrossed the soft soil, some fresh, others partially erased by the frost. There was a subtle tension in the village air, as though the collective conscience of its inhabitants had been shaken by the recent events, leaving them uncertain and watchful. At the post office, Miss Weatherby paused mid-sorting, glancing over her spectacles toward Miss Marple with a flicker of relief, as if expecting someone reliable to interpret the chaos of whispers that had begun to circulate. The conversations were hushed but incessant, gossip threading through the village like a delicate, persistent web. Miss Marple, with her customary patience, listened and catalogued the details, noting the inconsistencies, hesitations, and tiny slips that might hint at what each person wished to conceal. She understood that in small villages, people often spoke in half-truths and layered meanings, and it was within those subtleties that the real story waited to be discerned. Inspector Craddock arrived mid-morning, his demeanor brisk and purposeful, though his eyes betrayed the weight of unspoken concern. He moved to the churchyard, surveying the scene with professional care, noting the frost-disturbed soil, the flattened leaves, and the precise position of the silver key that had drawn so much attention the previous day. Miss Marple followed unobtrusively, observing the constable's movements and the subtle reactions of the few villagers who had dared to remain near the boundary. Craddock's questions were methodical, yet there was a hint of frustration in his voice, as if he sensed the answer lay beyond immediate evidence. Miss Marple, by contrast, noted that while physical signs were important, the behavior of those present would provide far deeper insight. She observed Mr. Sims adjusting his coat repeatedly while avoiding the inspector's gaze, Mrs. Gresham's eyes flicking nervously toward the gate, and Cecily Parry's fingers twisting her handkerchief as she stood at a discreet distance. Each movement, each reaction, seemed to confirm that the ripples of fear and guilt were already spreading, and that someone among them held knowledge crucial to understanding the murder. As the day progressed, Miss Marple moved quietly among the villagers, engaging in casual conversation that revealed far more than the words themselves conveyed. Mrs. Price Ridley, speaking in her usual rapid, nervous manner, alluded to a past disagreement between Phelps and a retired solicitor, though she offered no details. The vicar's niece, Clara Dane, was unusually withdrawn, her pale face showing traces of apprehension whenever the subject arose. Even Mr. Pendleton, whose composure had seemed unshakable, displayed subtle signs of irritation and unease, a slight tightening of the jaw, a hand brushing absently across his coat as though warding off an invisible accusation. Miss Marple noted that the interplay of these signals suggested not random fear but a carefully orchestrated tension, one that indicated prior knowledge, expectation, or guilt. She allowed each interaction to unfold, watching reactions, comparing them to previous observations, and filing away every detail in her mind, like threads to be woven into a larger tapestry. By afternoon, Craddock had gathered several villagers for questioning at the inn, though he remained discreet, aware of the delicate balance required in a community so close-knit. Miss Marple joined them, ostensibly for a cup of tea, but her attention never wavered from the nuances of human behavior. The conversation was polite yet guarded, each participant wary of overstepping, and each statement revealing hints of concealed truths. Miss Marple noticed that the manner in which questions were answered, the slight hesitations before a reply, and the careful choice of words suggested that someone was attempting to mislead, while others were unconsciously revealing their understanding of the underlying tension. She focused particularly on subtle gestures, a twitch of an eyebrow, the brief avoidance of eye contact, a nervous shift of weight. These, she knew, were often far more telling than spoken words. Later, Miss Marple revisited the churchyard alone, crouching beside the impressions in the soil. She studied the path leading to the spot where Mr. Phelps had fallen, noting that it suggested deliberate guidance rather than a simple accident. The mud smudges on the coat, the scuffed leaves, and the precise placement of the silver key all pointed toward careful orchestration. She allowed herself a faint, knowing smile, recognizing that the orchestrator had counted on attention being drawn to the obvious, while the essential truths remained overlooked. It was, as always, the human element, the reactions, the concealed motives, the fears and pride that would reveal the perpetrator. Miss Marple's mind began to map out the patterns she had observed throughout the day, understanding that these would form the foundation of her eventual solution. As twilight descended and the chill deepened, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, the village quiet now save for the occasional murmur of wind through the hedges. She set down her basket, poured herself a cup of tea, and reflected on the interactions, gestures, and subtle signals of the day. Every detail, no matter how minor, could be a clue. The nervous adjustment of a coat, the fleeting glance of recognition, the way a voice betrayed controlled emotion. She knew that as the villagers speculated and whispered, the truth remained hidden but patient, awaiting the careful eye that could read the story beneath appearances. Settling into her chair by the fire, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction, aware that the path to unraveling Mr. Phelps's death was already taking shape in her mind, guided by human nature itself and the subtle cues only an observer like her could truly understand. The morning brought with it a pale, steady drizzle, settling over St. Mary Mead like a silvery veil that softened the edges of buildings and hedgerows alike. Miss Marple, wrapped in her familiar shawl, moved slowly along the village lanes, taking in the subtle signs of life that hinted at unease beneath the everyday routine. The post office window reflected her image as she passed, and for a moment she paused to note the tight lines of worry etched on Miss Weatherby's face. Even those who were outwardly composed carried with them the weight of yesterday's shocking discovery, and the entire village seemed suspended in a state of quiet speculation. Each cautious glance, each hurried whisper, Miss Marple catalogued with the meticulous patience that had long served her in unraveling the complexities of human behavior. It was in these understated motions, the twitch of a hand, the hesitance in a reply, the almost imperceptible avoidance of eye contact, that she found the truest indicators of thought and motive. By mid-morning, Inspector Craddock had returned, his steps purposeful yet slightly heavy, reflecting the burden of a case that defied simple explanation. He walked to the churchyard first, accompanied by Constable. Reeves and Miss Marple followed at a discreet distance, observing both their movements and the few villagers who had gathered near the boundary. The frost had begun to yield to the day's moisture, revealing faint marks in the soil, the subtle impression of a shoe sole, and the precise location of the silver key that had so captured the attention of all the witnesses. Craddock crouched to examine these traces, murmuring to himself about the lack of overt struggle in the apparent suddenness of the man's fall. Miss Marple noted the slight frown that tugged at the inspector's brow, and the way he lingered over the key, as though its significance pressed upon him even if he could not articulate it fully. Observing the constable's manner and the reactions of the villagers, she felt the familiar spark of anticipation. The arrangement of human behavior was often far more revealing than any physical evidence. Groups of villagers moved cautiously about the churchyard and lanes, their whispered conjectures forming a background murmur that Miss Marple absorbed with quiet acuity. Mrs. Bantry's hands twitched nervously, while Mrs. Price Ridley leaned forward with animated whisperings to anyone within earshot, the cadence of her voice betraying a mix of excitement and fear. Mr. Pendleton, maintaining an air of composed authority, shifted his gaze from one person to another, a subtle sign of concern betraying his otherwise measured demeanor. Clara Dane lingered near the hedge, her pale fingers twisting a handkerchief with a nervous rhythm that did not escape Miss Marple's notice. Each of these gestures, small and easily dismissed, formed a network of signs from which she could begin to infer relationships, tensions, and potential motives. She understood instinctively that the murder was not random. The layers of observation and subtle manipulation would reveal a carefully orchestrated scene, and a human culprit whose actions were guided by both calculation and opportunity. After a brief visit to the inn for tea, Miss Marple rejoined Craddock and Reeves at the churchyard, where the soil was gradually darkening under the persistent drizzle. She crouched beside the footprints, noting their depth, direction, and the faint drag marks near the edge of the hedgerow. The placement of the silver key appeared deliberate, attracting attention while simultaneously obscuring the more telling signs around it. She allowed her mind to trace possible movements, considering who might have had both the motive and the ability to orchestrate such a scene with such careful attention to human perception. She compared these impressions with the behavior she had observed throughout the morning, the fleeting glances, the nervous adjustments of clothing, and the subtle expressions that flitted across faces when the subject of Mr. Phelps was mentioned. Each observation added another thread to the tapestry she was quietly weaving, a map of intentions hidden beneath ordinary appearances. By mid-afternoon, Craddock had conducted preliminary interviews with several key villagers, though he remained conscious of the delicate balance between inquiry and alarm. Miss Marple joined them under the pretense of casual conversation, listening carefully to statements and watching the tiny gestures that accompanied them. Mr. Sims, insisting he had been arranging tables for tea, could not entirely mask a faint blush when Craddock's gaze lingered, while Mrs. Gresham's hands fidgeted with the edge of her parasol as she provided her account. Cecily Parry, speaking in quiet tones, seemed almost hesitant to meet anyone's eyes, suggesting either uncertainty or fear. Miss Marple, perceiving the subtle interplay of avoidance and tension, understood that these were not mere nervous habits, but indicators of deeper truths. She recorded them silently in her mind, recognizing that the answers lay not in what was plainly spoken, but in the careful observation of conduct and timing. As the drizzle continued, forming rivulets along the cobbles, Miss Marple finally returned to the churchyard alone. The key glinted faintly in the muted light, yet her attention was drawn to the minutiae surrounding it, the slight disturbance of the ivy near the wall, the softened impression of footsteps approaching the spot, and the way the environment suggested deliberate arrangement. She allowed herself a faint smile, appreciating the craft behind the scene. The murderer had relied on expectation and distraction, trusting that attention would be drawn to the obvious while the truth remained hidden. Sitting for a moment on a low stone, she contemplated the patterns of human behavior, confident that with patience, careful observation, and subtle deduction, the mystery of Mr. Phelps' death would yield its secrets. She rose, her mind already mapping connections, noting inconsistencies, and preparing for the careful unraveling that would eventually lead to the revelation that no one in St. Mary Mead yet suspected, but that was quietly taking shape beneath the ordinary rhythms of village life. The morning air carried a faint chill as Miss Marple made her way along the familiar lanes of St. Mary Mead, the damp earth giving off the faint scent of frost and fallen leaves. Her eyes swept over the subtle shifts in the village since Mr. Phelps's untimely death, noting the small details that often escaped casual observation. The slight hesitation in the steps of Mrs. Price Ridley as she approached the churchyard, the way Mr. Pendleton's hand brushed absently across his coat lapel, and the careful vigilance of the vicar's niece, Clara Dane, whose gaze seemed constantly on alert. Each of these minor gestures, Miss Marple reflected, revealed more than words ever could. Fear, guilt, and concealed knowledge often left marks that only the patient observer could discern. She paused briefly at the edge of the lane where the garden tea had been held, noting the slight depression in the soil, the flattened leaves and the small traces of mud that hinted at hurried movement the day before. Even as villagers continued their routines, she understood that every action now carried a weight of suspicion, whether intended or not. By mid-morning, Inspector Craddock had returned from another round of interviews with the village residents, his brow furrowed in concentration. He moved deliberately to the churchyard, accompanied by Constable Reeves, examining the softened ground, the faint impressions of shoes, and the small silver key that remained a curious focal point. Miss Marple followed, allowing him space, observing the constable's gestures and the subtle reactions of those present. There was a quiet tension among the few villagers who lingered, their whispers forming a thin undercurrent of speculation that Miss Marple absorbed carefully. She noted Mr. Simms's restless pacing, the faint twitch in Mrs. Gresham's fingers, and Cecily Parry's tentative glance toward the path leading away from the churchyard. Each of these small signals suggested layers of concern, perhaps even knowledge, that had yet to surface in speech. Miss Marple, as always, catalogued them meticulously, aware that understanding human behavior was as crucial to solving the mystery as any physical clue. The inspector began speaking with the villagers, asking pointed questions about movements, sightings, and interactions during the period leading up to Mr. Phelps' death. Statements were carefully measured, each person presenting themselves as calm, cooperative, and shocked by the tragedy. Yet Miss Marple, attentive to nuance, detected discrepancies. A pause too long, a glance too quick, a hand that shook subtly as it gestured. Mr. Pendleton's account of his whereabouts seemed precise, almost rehearsed, while Mrs. Gresham's narrative, though polite and consistent, was punctuated with fleeting anxiety. Miss Marple reflected on the interplay of these behaviors, aware that fear and guilt often manifested unconsciously, revealing truths that the conscious mind sought to hide. She quietly compared these observations to her notes from previous days, building a mental map of interactions, motives, and opportunity, understanding that the pattern was slowly emerging beneath the surface of polite conversation and orderly statements. By noon, a light drizzle had begun, dampening the soil and softening the outlines of footprints, yet Miss Marple could still trace the sequence of movement around the scene. She knelt briefly to study the path from the gate to the spot where Mr. Phelps had fallen, noting that the direction and depth of impressions suggested a deliberate movement, almost choreographed to appear accidental. The silver key lay nearby, its presence drawing immediate attention, yet it seemed, to her trained eye, to be a distraction more than evidence, placed with intention to obscure the true narrative. She allowed herself a faint, almost imperceptible smile, appreciating the subtlety of the orchestration. Whoever had arranged this scene had relied on human expectation, assuming that observers would focus on the key while overlooking the more telling signs embedded in the soil, the hedgerows, and the behavior of those who witnessed the event. In the early afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the inn, where Craddock was quietly reviewing statements and notes. Villagers came and went, offering fragments of recollection, their voices laced with speculation and unease. Miss Marple joined them under the guise of casual interest, listening attentively, her eyes scanning for expressions, gestures, and signs of nervousness. Mrs. Price Ridley, talking animatedly to anyone within earshot, betrayed a subtle tension in her hands and eyes, hinting at knowledge or concern that she did not openly admit. Mr. Sims's composure occasionally faltered under a passing glance from Craddock, his blush barely perceptible, but telling. Miss Marple catalogued these details quietly, understanding that each unguarded reaction was a thread in the fabric of truth, and that the weave of fear, pride, and secrecy among the villagers would ultimately reveal the identity of the person responsible for orchestrating the tragedy. By late afternoon, the drizzle had lightened to a mist, and Miss Marple returned once more to the churchyard, crouching beside the impressions in the damp soil. She traced the arc of movement, noting where leaves were disturbed, where footprints deepened, and where the silver key rested, observing how the scene had been manipulated to attract attention in specific ways. She reflected on the human element that had guided this orchestration, recognizing that the murderer had relied on expectation and distraction, counting on observers to focus on the obvious while missing the more subtle truths embedded in behavior and environment. Settling briefly on a low stone, she allowed her mind to trace the sequence of actions, the possible motives, and the hidden interactions that had shaped the event, confident that, with careful observation and patience, the puzzle would soon begin to resolve itself, revealing the truth that no one in St. Mary Mead yet suspected, but which was quietly becoming clear in her mind. By the next morning, the village had settled into a tense routine, the memory of Mr. Phelps' sudden death lingering like a shadow over St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple set out along the familiar lanes with her usual deliberate pace, noting the dampness of the earth and the faint marks left by villagers' footsteps in the frost-thinned soil. The air was brisk, carrying the faint aroma of smoke from early fires, and the soft rustle of leaves whispered faintly underfoot. She observed the villagers as she passed, noting their cautious glances and careful movements. Mrs. Price Ridley hurried along the lane with a small parcel clutched tightly, her eyes flicking nervously toward anyone she passed, while Mr. Pendleton adjusted his coat with a stiffness that betrayed unspoken unease. Even Clara Dane, usually reserved and gentle, walked with a tentative step, her gaze wandering to the churchyard as if expecting to see something she had not yet dared to imagine. Miss Marple catalogued these subtle signals with patient precision, understanding that human behavior often concealed more than it revealed, yet the smallest slip could betray a hidden truth. By mid-morning, Inspector Craddock arrived once again, his presence commanding but tempered with weariness from the days of investigation. He made his way to the churchyard, accompanied by Constable Reeves, examining the ground with careful attention, noting faint disturbances in the frost-melted soil and the precise location of the silver key. Miss Marple followed unobtrusively, keeping her distance while observing both the inspector and the villagers gathered nearby. The air was thick with quiet speculation, a blend of fear and curiosity that seemed almost tangible. Mr. Sims shifted from foot to foot, avoiding Craddock's gaze, while Mrs. Gresham's hands clasped her parasol tightly as she whispered to a neighbor. Each subtle motion, each hesitant glance, provided Miss Marple with a wealth of information that she quietly recorded in her mind, aware that the key to unraveling the mystery lay not in the obvious clues, but in the delicate interplay of human actions and reactions. Craddock began speaking with the villagers, carefully noting inconsistencies and contradictions in their statements. While outwardly calm, Miss Marple observed that their voices and gestures betrayed unspoken tension. Mr. Pendleton's account of his movements was precise to the point of seeming rehearsed, while Mrs. Gresham's narrative, though consistent, contained fleeting moments of hesitation. Cecily Parry, who lingered at a distance, provided only brief answers, her fingers twisting nervously around the edge of her handkerchief. Miss Marple noticed how these tiny signals suggested underlying knowledge or anxiety, subtle hints of consciousness that could easily escape a less attentive observer. She reflected on how villagers' responses often revealed the intersection of fear, pride, and secrecy, and that through careful observation, one could reconstruct the sequence of events as accurately as any physical evidence could convey. By noon, Miss Marple had returned briefly to her cottage to gather her notes, reflecting on the web of interactions she had observed. She considered the precise placement of the key, the impressions in the soil, and the faint smears on Mr. Phelps' coat, recognizing that these were all elements deliberately designed to mislead immediate judgment. The murderer had relied upon human expectation, assuming that observers would be drawn to the visible and overlook the subtle truths embedded in conduct, timing, and the environment. The patterns she had observed suggested a mind accustomed to manipulating others' perceptions, orchestrating attention to disguise intent, while exposing only what was necessary to maintain appearances. In the early afternoon, she returned to the inn, where Craddock reviewed statements with meticulous care. Villagers drifted in and out, offering fragments of recollection, each word tinged with fear or speculation. Miss Marple joined the group casually, listening attentively and observing the minor gestures accompanying each statement, a shift of weight, a fleeting glance, a quiver of the lip. Mrs. Price Ridley, speaking rapidly to anyone nearby, revealed subtle tension in her hands and face, hinting at knowledge or involvement she did not consciously disclose. Mr. Sims's composure occasionally faltered under Craddock's questioning, while Clara Dane's quiet demeanor suggested that she might know more than she admitted. Each of these signals, Miss Marple realized, formed part of a broader pattern, one that would eventually lead to the understanding of how the crime had been orchestrated and by whom. By late afternoon, Miss Marple ventured once more to the churchyard, crouching beside the dampened soil to study the traces left behind. She traced the arc of movement, noting where leaves were disturbed, where footprints deepened, and the subtle positioning of the silver key, all signs that pointed toward deliberate planning. The scene revealed the murderer's careful reliance on distraction and expectation, using attention to mislead while the real clues remained in the unnoticed corners. Settling briefly on a low stone, she contemplated the connections between villagers' behaviors, the faint inconsistencies in their statements, and the orchestration of the scene itself. Her mind traced possible sequences and interactions, aware that the truth lay hidden beneath the ordinary rhythms of the village. Patience and observation would reveal it, as always, and Miss Marple felt the quiet certainty that the puzzle was slowly yielding to her understanding, ready to be unraveled by the careful alignment of evidence and human insight. The morning arrived with a crisp clarity, the mist lifting from St. Mary Mead and revealing the familiar outlines of hedgerows, church spire, and cobbled lanes. Miss Marple set out on her customary walk, her eyes sweeping over the village with an attentiveness that belied the quiet pace of her steps. She noted the subtle signs of the villagers' unease, the hurried movements of Mrs. Price Ridley, the occasional darting glance of Mr. Pendleton, and the almost imperceptible trembling of Clara Dane's fingers as she adjusted her scarf. Even those who maintained a calm exterior betrayed a slight tension in posture or expression that suggested worry or hidden knowledge. Miss Marple, as always, catalogued these details with patient care, aware that it was often the smallest, most unconscious signals that revealed the truth. The path leading to the churchyard bore new traces of movement from the early morning, faint depressions in the soft soil and disturbed leaves that suggested someone had visited the site before the official inquiries began. She crouched briefly to study the impressions, noting their direction, depth, and the subtle drag marks that indicated hesitation or uncertainty in the steps taken. By mid-morning, Inspector Craddock had arrived, accompanied by Constable Reeves, their presence commanding yet careful, mindful of the delicate atmosphere that permeated the village. Craddock surveyed the churchyard, his eyes scanning the damp ground and the position of the silver key that continued to draw attention despite the obvious disturbance of the scene. Miss Marple followed at a respectful distance, observing both the inspector's focused scrutiny and the villagers who lingered nearby, some out of curiosity, others from a lingering sense of fear. Mr. Sims fidgeted with his hat, avoiding Craddock's gaze, while Mrs. Gresham's gloved hands clasped tightly around the handle of her parasol, her posture rigid with anxiety. Cecily Parry, standing at a discreet distance, seemed reluctant to speak, her eyes following the movements of the constables with quiet apprehension. Each small gesture, hesitation, or glance suggested underlying tension, revealing information beyond spoken words, and Miss Marple absorbed it all, silently, filing away the details for later reflection. As interviews continued, Craddock questioned the villagers methodically, seeking clarity on movements, sightings, and interactions surrounding the fatal event. While each individual offered a controlled account, Miss Marple's practiced eye detected subtle inconsistencies and fleeting signs of nervousness. Mr. Pendleton's description of his morning movements, precise yet slightly too deliberate, suggested rehearsal, whereas Mrs. Gresham's narrative, although coherent, contained micro-pauses that indicated concealed awareness or worry. Clara Dane's quiet answers, careful and limited, hinted at knowledge she was unwilling or afraid to reveal. Miss Marple noted how these nuanced behaviors provided more insight than any explicit statement, revealing connections, motives, and possibly hidden complicity. She reflected that understanding human behavior often uncovered the truth where physical evidence alone might lead to conjecture, and she continued to map these observations carefully in her mind, building a complex web of interactions, fears, and intentions. By early afternoon, the village atmosphere had shifted toward quiet speculation, with groups forming and dispersing along the lanes, their hushed conversations carrying fragments of rumor, conjecture, and fear. Miss Marple moved among them casually, listening, observing, and interpreting. Mrs. Price Ridley's rapid speech and nervous gestures suggested more than mere excitement. They hinted at a knowledge she might prefer to conceal. Mr. Sims's composure wavered under scrutiny, and Clara Dane's demureness seemed a mask for concern she could not voice. Miss Marple noted how these subtle signals intertwined, forming patterns that revealed relational dynamics, hidden motives, and the pressures that each individual faced in the aftermath of the tragedy. She understood that the human element, the interplay of fear, pride, secrecy, and guilt, was as critical to unraveling the case as the physical traces left behind in the churchyard. By mid-afternoon, a soft drizzle began, darkening the soil and adding a reflective sheen to the footprints and disturbed leaves. Miss Marple returned to the churchyard alone, crouching to examine the path leading to the spot where Mr. Phelps had fallen. The impressions suggested careful, deliberate movements with pauses that implied hesitation or calculation. The silver key, resting nearby, drew the eye but seemed, to her practiced observation, a distraction more than an essential clue. She noted how the scene had been orchestrated to focus attention away from the subtle but telling signs, and she considered the behavior of the villagers, each gesture and glance contributing to a picture of what had occurred. Settling briefly on a stone, she allowed her mind to trace sequences, motives, and interactions, recognizing that patience, observation, and the careful reading of human behavior would reveal the orchestrator behind the tragedy. The quiet certainty of understanding grew within her as the puzzle slowly aligned in her mind, ready to be unraveled by her insight into the subtleties that others overlooked. The day broke over St. Mary Mead with an unusual stillness, as if the village itself held its breath in anticipation of revelations yet to come. Miss Marple walked the familiar lanes with her shawl drawn snugly around her shoulders, her eyes quietly observing the subtle disturbances that human anxiety leaves in its wake. Footsteps in the softened soil, faint impressions where carts had passed, and the occasional scuff of a shoe on the cobbles. All these small details spoke to her trained eye of movements, hesitations, and intentions that no one else would consider significant. Mrs. Price Ridley hurried past with her small bundle clasped tightly, casting furtive glances at those she passed, while Mr. Pendleton's usual composure was punctuated by a stiffened posture and the occasional restless adjustment of his coat. Even Clara Dane, who moved quietly along the lane, carried an unmistakable tension in the set of her shoulders and the pace of her steps. Miss Marple catalogued all of these minute signals, understanding that in a village such as this, human behavior often revealed far more than spoken words, and that the hidden currents of fear, pride, and guilt would eventually point toward the truth. By mid-morning, Inspector Craddock and Constable Reeves had arrived once more, their presence measured yet alert, as they moved deliberately toward the churchyard. Miss Marple followed, maintaining a discreet distance, her gaze sweeping over the dampened soil and the subtle traces left by early visitors. The silver key remained in its conspicuous position, drawing the attention of several villagers who had ventured near, yet Miss Marple's trained eye recognized it as a distraction, deliberately placed to mislead observers, while the more telling signs lay in the faint impressions of shoes, the smoothed-over patches of earth, and the disturbed leaves along the path. Mr. Sims shifted uneasily, avoiding the inspector's gaze, while Mrs. Gresham clasped her parasol tightly, her hands betraying slight tremors despite the controlled tone of her conversation. Cecily Parry lingered near the hedge, hesitant to offer information, yet visibly attuned to every word and movement around her. Miss Marple absorbed all these behaviors, considering how they might reveal intentions, knowledge, and concealed emotions. Craddock conducted interviews with care, seeking to reconcile discrepancies between accounts while maintaining the villagers' composure. While all appeared cooperative, Miss Marple observed the subtle tensions that each statement betrayed. Mr. Pendleton's account, though precise, carried the faint undertone of rehearsed movements, whereas Mrs. Gresham's narrative, although fluent, included tiny pauses that hinted at suppressed knowledge or concern. Clara Dane's responses were brief and measured, suggesting either fear or hesitation to disclose more than necessary. Miss Marple noted that these nuances, more than any physical evidence, illuminated relationships, motives, and possible complicity, providing insight into the psychology that had shaped the events of the previous day. She reflected that in small villages, the orchestration of appearances often concealed intentions, and that the careful reading of human behavior was essential to revealing the truth. By early afternoon, the drizzle had thickened, leaving the ground dark and reflective and softening the impressions that might have revealed the sequence of movements more clearly. Miss Marple returned to the inn briefly, observing the villagers as they came and went, noting the manner in which fear and speculation shaped their interactions. Mrs. Price Ridley's rapid, nervous speech and hand gestures betrayed more than she voiced, hinting at private anxieties or secrets. Mr. Sims displayed subtle signs of unease when questioned, while Clara Dane's quiet attentiveness suggested a mind occupied with considerations she had yet to articulate. Each interaction contributed to the broader picture Miss Marple was constructing, a complex web of relationships, secrets, and psychological pressure. Later, she revisited the churchyard alone, crouching beside the faint impressions in the damp soil. She traced the subtle arcs of movement, the smoothed patches where attention had been directed away from crucial clues, and the deliberate positioning of the silver key. The scene, she recognized, had been designed to distract and mislead, relying on expectation rather than overt action to obscure the truth. Miss Marple reflected on the patterns of behavior she had observed over the preceding days, noting how fear, pride and secrecy had influenced every response, every gesture, and every glance. Settling briefly on a low stone, she allowed herself a moment to synthesize the observations into a coherent sequence of likely events, recognizing that patience, meticulous attention to detail, and the careful reading of human psychology were gradually revealing the identity of the orchestrator behind the tragedy. The sense of quiet certainty grew within her as each behavioral clue aligned with another, forming an invisible yet unmistakable pathway to the solution that awaited revelation. The village of St. Mary Mead carried an unusually hushed air that morning, as though the earth itself held its breath in anticipation of the truth about to be revealed. Miss Marple walked the familiar lanes with a quiet purpose, observing with her customary acuity the subtle shifts in villagers' expressions and posture that spoke louder than words. Mr. Pendleton's habitual composure now seemed strained, his eyes flicking momentarily toward the churchyard, as though expecting to see some hidden presence. Mrs. Price Ridley's fingers fidgeted incessantly with the edge of her handkerchief, and Clara Dane's gaze lingered a little too long on her shoes, betraying anxiety she did not voice. Even the air itself seemed laden with expectation, thick with unspoken fears and half-formed suspicions. Miss Marple, as always, catalogued these gestures with patient precision, aware that the truth often lay in what was not said and in the tiny betrayals of the human body and mind. Each hesitant step, each evasive glance, each micro-expression contributed to the picture she had been quietly assembling over days of careful observation. She arrived at the churchyard, where Inspector Craddock and Constable Reeves were already present, reviewing the positions of the disturbed earth and the incongruous silver key that had captivated attention since the incident. The key, as Miss Marple had long suspected, was more a diversion than a clue, placed with careful intention to focus observation away from the more revealing signs. She crouched by the footprints and disturbed leaves, tracing the arcs and pressures left in the softened soil, noting the subtle signs of hesitation, retreat, and approach that indicated the sequence of movements in the moments before Mr. Phelps's fall. Her mind moved swiftly, linking these physical cues with the behavioral observations she had gathered. The nervous twitch of Mrs. Price Ridley's hands, Mr. Simms's carefully measured evasions, and Clara Dane's cautious attentiveness. Each behavior now fell into a coherent pattern, revealing not only the orchestration of the scene, but also the psychology that had guided it. Miss Marple straightened and approached the small assembly of villagers, her tone gentle yet resolute. She began by recounting observations of mannerisms and movements she had noticed over recent days, framing them as casual reflections rather than pointed accusations. The villagers listened, some with curiosity, others with visible tension, unaware that she was laying the groundwork for the revelation. "It is often the little things," she said. "A glance too long, a hand that trembles, a movement made in anticipation of what others might see, that tells us far more than what is spoken." Her gaze settled for a moment on Mr. Sims, who shifted uncomfortably, and on Mrs. Price Ridley, whose face had paled slightly under the soft morning light. She then gently led the group through the sequence of events as she understood them, aligning the behavior of each person with the timing and arrangement of the scene. The deliberate placement of the key, the faint disturbances in the soil, the direction of footprints, and the pauses and retreats all pointed toward a singular truth. Miss Marple explained with quiet clarity how the orchestrator had relied on misdirection and expectation, knowing that others would focus on the conspicuous, while the subtle signs revealed the true course of action. Slowly, the pieces fell into place for those present, and a silence settled over the assembly as comprehension dawned. Finally, she turned her attention to the subtle but undeniable indications that pointed to one individual whose actions had been guided by a mixture of fear, calculation, and personal grievance. She noted the avoidance of eye contact, the nervous manipulations of gloves and handkerchief, and the tiny hesitations that had marked each interview. It was Mrs. Price Ridley who, confronted with the gentle but inescapable synthesis of physical evidence and behavioral observation, felt the weight of her deception laid bare. Her composure faltered, and in a tremulous voice she admitted the truth, confessing that she had orchestrated the scene to conceal a quarrel with Mr. Phelps that had escalated unexpectedly, and that she had relied on expectation and misdirection to mask her culpability. The villagers listened in stunned silence, their earlier gossip and conjecture suddenly rendered moot by the clarity of Miss Marple's deductions. Inspector Craddock nodded in appreciation, recognizing the precision and subtlety of her reasoning, while the constable quietly recorded the confession for official proceedings. Miss Marple, ever composed, reflected on the interplay of human nature, observing how pride, fear, and hidden resentment had guided each action, leaving subtle trails for the patient observer to follow. The village, though relieved at the resolution of the mystery, retained a faint undercurrent of unease, a reminder that even the most ordinary lives could conceal profound and dangerous passions. As the sun began to break through the clouds, illuminating the churchyard with soft light, Miss Marple quietly withdrew from the scene, her mind already turning to the patterns she had observed and the unspoken truths that lingered in the village. There was a calm satisfaction in knowing that the intricate web of deceit had been untangled through observation, patience, and the careful reading of human behavior, leaving St. Mary Mead to return to its ordinary rhythms, forever altered by the revelations of a single, silent witness.